minutes long, that's all I had time for. I'm
Good
like,
evening. Welcome.
there he is.
Never mind, as you.
Hold 30 seconds, and you're gonna see the entrance of another room.
We all, should we clap?
Yes.
Standing ovation?
We should. He'll be standing, I think.
Are you gonna be leaning against the wall?
I'll be standing for the most part. I'll sit for a little bit.
Don't bother.
He's not gonna sit. He's not.
He said briefly.
Okay, okay.
Except for
Good
now we have to
evening
make him stand.
again. Pardon the false alarm there. Welcome to the October meeting of the Granville Exempted Village School District Board of Education, and I invite you to rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. It's wonderful to see, especially the young people that were here to celebrate, but I understand some of them are on a tight schedule, so welcome.
Dr. Foreman.
Here.
Ms. Dietz. Mr. Denise.
Here.
Mr. Miller.
Here.
Dr. Mantel.
Here.
Okay, I'm off. Which means you might get out of here soon. All right, tonight we start by honoring 9 Granville High School seniors who received the National Merit Scholarship recognition for their scores on the PSAT National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test. Each year, approximately 50,000 or the top 3% of students who took the test are recognized by the National Merit Corporation. Approximately 2/3, 34,000 students of the high scores are recognized as commended students. Although commended students do not continue in the competition for National Merit Scholarships, some of these students do become candidates for special scholarships sponsored by corporations and businesses. About 1/3, 16,000 of the candidates are named National Merit semifinalists and are among the highest scoring entrants from each state. These students continue in the program to compete for scholarships. We congratulate these students for achieving this high academic honor. Our district is proud of their accomplishments. And I will tell you that many of these students, although very, very bright, are also very well-rounded. You see them on the playing field, on the stage, performing, doing a lot of different things. So I think we do a great job of creating with a partnership with parents. Now, we can't take all the credit. Well-rounded students, and we're very excited for these students tonight. So honorees, tonight we have 2 semifinalists, Margot McDonald and Max Rosenfeld. Either side. Or in the middle. Right over here.
They didn't get that part. They get it, that wasn't bad.
Okay, thank you. Congratulations. And our 7 commended scholars, Amelia Anderson, Miranda Dickerman, Chris Duncan, Sarah Emery, Alex Grabe, Hannah Sullivan, and Karen Troutman. Come on up. Chris and Hannah. There you go. Okay, now we need to turn this direction to take pictures. Good. Congratulations. Don't forget that you have this little card from the actual National Merit Scholarship Program, but Margot and Max, you didn't get one of these because as your semifinals, and you're continuing on, so you'll get something later, I'm sure. So, Karen, I know you have to go. You're free to go. Parents, you have to stay for 2 more minutes. No. You can go too.
If
You
you
can
have
go
to.
too.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
You're
Thank
welcome
you
to
very
stay.
much. Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Hi, Jen.
Thanks.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
It's a very active season right now.
It is. Congratulations, Matt.
Next, we are honoring 2 staff members.
Nobody knows.
2 Granville High School teachers, both who have achieved better than expected student results over the last couple of years of classroom teaching. Value-added data, along with principal feedback, was used to nominate these teachers for the annual Battelle for Kids Celebrate Excellence Award. In June 2013, Pam Thompson and Keith Mullins were selected and honored by Battelle for demonstrating excellence in classroom instruction. Tonight we recognize Keith Mullins. Mr. Mullins is widely respected at GHS for helping students take their writing to the next level of sophistication. He is regularly cited by his graduates as having a profound impact on their success in college writing. Next, we have Pam Thompson. Mrs. Thompson is our resident master of calculus, which is scary in and of itself. So she does an outstanding job of helping students master difficult calculus A, B, and BC material. And the same can be said for her work with the Algebra 2 students. So I'd like to honor Pam and Keith at this time for their excellent We had practice. We had the Battelle conference, so we were able to get these pictures in before. So thank you very much. And that concludes the commendations for tonight. Oh, okay. All right.
Give me a shot.
Yes, thanks, Michelle. All right. What's that? Well, let me,
Okay.
yep. I think so. Yes. Next, we have Mr. Sobel with our 5-year forecast presentation.
Yes. I would too.
Mike, I'm gonna stand on the other side of the room for this
Yeah.
one.
That's okay.
Just
I
to
did
give-
shower this morning, though.
Just a little context as Mike is getting prepared. The school district is required to submit a 5-year forecast 2 times a year, once in October and also in May. So this is our October 5-year forecast.
Thank you. I will,
The short version, right? The short version, right?
I'll limit it to an hour and a half.
Appreciate that.
You're welcome. Okay, an overview of the 5-year forecast process. There's a couple different ways you can look at the forecast. You can look at it as just trying to meet state requirements, or you can look at it as really a planning document for the district and a spending plan over the next few years. And that is how this is put together, is really as a spending plan for the next 5 years. The base levels of spending that are in here make the assumption that the levy in 2 weeks is going to pass. However, we are not allowed to turn in a forecast that assumes that the levy has passed. We are not allowed to include those revenues in our forecast. So there are some generic reductions, general reductions, nothing specifically laid out, that we're using that essentially will go into effect if the levy does not pass on November 5th. And I'll talk about those in a little bit more detail, but not a lot, a little bit later on in the presentation. 2 major forecast risks here. Obviously, the passage of the levy is a big risk at this point. If it doesn't pass, we will be looking at a fund deficit at the end of the next school year and a very large deficit the year after that. And so we will have to begin reductions fairly soon after the election, and then another set at the end of the school year should the levy not pass. The second really major risk to the funding, or to the 5-year forecast, is what the level of state funding guarantee is going to be for the 15-16 school year. And you see by this graph why that's such a big issue. These are two graphs showing our fund balances, both assuming that the levy passes. So there's not a levy passing, levy not passing in here. They both assume the levy will pass. The difference in the funding guarantees is the blue bars on here assume that the funding guarantee from in the last 3 years of the forecast are at the level for the 12-13 school year. That was what was in the budget this time, is the 12-13 spending level is a guarantee both in this year and next year. And that's kind of a departure from what the legislature has done in the past. In the past, quite often, they use the prior year as the guarantee rather than a previous year. And the red bar is what happens if you have a moving guarantee over the last 3 years, where essentially the guarantee in 15 and 16 is the same, is equal to the funding in 14 and 15. And where you see the real difference is out here in 2018. Under a guarantee at the 2012-13 level, I'm projecting a fund balance only of $400,000 by the end of that fiscal year. Essentially, we'll be back into a point where we're looking at options. With a prior year funding guarantee, instead of $400,000, the amount of money would be about $2.2 million at the end of 2018. That guarantee, the difference in the two, is worth $1.8 million over 3 years in funding to the district. And the problem is we are not going to know what that guarantee is until July of 2015. Because guarantees are always in temporary law in the budget, which means they are only in place for the current biennium, which is this year and next year. They will be reset and recalibrated, presumably, in 2015-16 school year, and at that point, once we get, when I'm doing this 2 years from now, we'll know what the guarantee is for what's now the last 3 years of the 5-year forecast period. A quick look at just our base forecast, and then a couple pieces along the way. The base forecast, and this is the base forecast assuming that the levy passes and assuming that the guarantee remains at the 12-13 level, shows us finishing this year with about a little over a $2 million balance, that growing up to $3 million at the end of the 2015-16 school year, and then quickly beginning to decline because of declines in state aid, which you'll see a little bit later on. So if the levy doesn't pass and we use the same level of spending that is in the forecast right now, we would finish this year with just under $1 million in the bank, and by next year we would be $300,000 in the hole by the end of the year, and at the end of the 15-16 school year we would be $2.7 million in the hole. And this right here, the $2.7 million, that's really where we have to have our eye. Because you can't deal with it, you can't wait till 15-16 to deal with that. We have to be in a position where we're dealing with that before going into the 14-15 school year in order to make spending adjustments that are not truly draconian to get to a balanced budget in 16. And so the forecast that the board that you'll be voting on tonight will look like this. It has a series of spending cuts in them, assuming no levy passes, that leaves us a little over $1 million both this year and next year, and a $49,000 balance in 2016. So 2 years out, we do have a positive fund balance. It is not really a functional positive fund balance, but it is a positive fund balance. And again, that's where the target was, assuming that the levy does not pass. The spending cuts, and these are working off of the base budget amount, and these are just approximations of what the cuts would have to be if the levy does not pass. At the remainder of this school year, we would not anticipate doing any cuts in personnel. And the full amount of cuts would become in purchase services and materials and supplies through the rest of this school year. At the end of this school year, going into next school year, we will need to make approximately $800,000 of reductions in personnel services. There's an automatic about $115,000 savings that would go with that, just from salary-driven benefits like SERS and Medicare. We would get about $200,000 in savings and benefits, which would be reduced health care costs because we would have fewer people because of the cuts, and then some additional cuts down here in purchase services and materials and supplies. And these cuts, these cuts down here go on for each year, but this set of cuts is what gets us to a $49,000 cash balance at the end of 2016. Now keep in mind, there is money built in right now to the budget to assume, we're assuming we're going to have some pay increases. If we negotiate, less increases or freezes if the levy fails, that will contribute towards the $800,000. It cannot completely make up the $800,000, but it will contribute to a portion of it. There would still have to be a need to do other things in the event that the levy does not pass. Questions? Taking a look at just some general data before we move into the specific forecasts. If you take a look at the per pupil spending in the district, you see the impacts of the reductions that we've made over the last couple of school years. From our 10-11 peak, there were some smaller reductions in 11 and 12, which dropped our per pupil spending by about $100 per pupil. The significant cuts that we made before last school year dropped our per pupil spending nearly $500, or actually nearly $700 from where it was in 2011 and 12. It's really to the point that our spending per pupil last year was about the same amount as it was in the 2008-2009 school year. So we were spending the same amount per pupil in the 12-13 school year as we were 4 years earlier.
Mike, from a comparison perspective, how does that cost per pupil compare to similar districts that most people compare ourselves to in Central Ohio?
If you look at the major high wealth, high achieving districts in Central Ohio, places like New Albany and Bexley, Upper Arlington, those type of places, most of those districts are spending anywhere from $12,000 to $16,000 per pupil right now. We are really anywhere from $3,000 to $6,000 per pupil spending lower than those comparable high achieving districts would be.
Thank you.
Okay, getting into the forecast. And we're going to start taking a look at how the forecast for October is differing from the forecast that we submitted back in May. In the revenue side, there are two major differences. One right here, we're collecting about $370,000 more in real estate taxes than we have been anticipating. The vast majority of that, $300,000, is in delinquency payments that we did not have built in back in May. The sale or agreement for sale over the summer of the Granville Inn, the Delmar property over in Prospect, and the old stone quarry down on 37 and James Road. each of those had significant delinquent taxes associated with it. The latter two of those sold, the other one has an agreement to sell, and with those 3 properties, we generated nearly $300,000 of delinquent tax payments. Of course, because they're delinquent tax payments, they will not recur. They are one-time sources of money, and you'll see a little later on how we have decided to use that one-time source of money rather than using it for ongoing spending. We did pick up about $60,000 from better compliance, and in reality, that's related to the $300,000 up above, because a lot of that is because those 3 properties are now paying timely instead of not making the payments and going delinquent. And so that's really the source of most of that $60,000. The only other change is down here in all other operating revenue, and that is because back in May we were still not sure how the all-day K program with tuition was going to finish this year. We ended up doing a little bit better than we anticipated doing as far as the number of students who are participating in the program, so those revenues ended up a little bit higher. On the spending side, and I know this looks like a lot of arrows, but there's really only one thing going on in all of this, or for the most part, and that is, you look at our personnel services, and our spending is about $80,000 higher projected for this year than it was back in May. The main reason for that is 3 changes that we made in our contracted services. Back in May, we were assuming that Mr. Dilbone would still be on the payroll of the Licking County ESC, and we had 2 employees who were paid under contracted services. After we did an assessment under, both looking at current law and the new healthcare law, it was determined that those 2 people really had much more of an employee-employer relationship with the district than a contracted services relationship. So both of them were brought onto the payroll, and then because of the change in the law that was in House Bill 59, the requirement that we have a administrator through the ESC was eliminated, and it was more cost effective for us to bring Mr. Dilbone back onto our own payroll rather than to continue paying him through the ESC. So the addition of those 3 folks, in reality, without that, the current spending projection would actually be lower than it was in May. We did realize some savings because we did have some staff turnover that occurred after the May forecast was submitted that we were not counting on, and several of those folks were replaced with lower cost people on the job. So really, all 4 of these 2 red arrows, that green arrow, and that green arrow right there, and that one there, all of those were primarily the result of the 3 folks that we brought onto the staff. Chuck's salary was right in here. That's is moved up, and the 2 other positions were in there that have moved up into here. And then their benefits are a little bit higher, again, because we have brought a couple of those folks back on. The only other thing that we are doing, and this gets back to the additional delinquency money that we received. Back in 2009, the bond fund made a payment, the first payment for the House Bill 264 energy projects on behalf of the operating budget. And we have been carrying that on the books now for the last 4 or 5 years as a liability from the operating budget and to the bond fund. And so essentially what we've done, that amount is about $240,000. So essentially what we've done is we've taken the money from the delinquencies, that was one-time money, and used it to make this one-time adjustment that we have been carrying on the books and saying, well, we'll do it next year. And so now we're actually going to go ahead and take that money and go ahead and make the change so we can get that liability off of the books. Our cash flow, and keep in mind, this is a cash flow without levy or cuts in place. That doesn't affect really this year much. It does affect next year. We're still projecting in January of this year to have a cash balance at the end of the month of $303,000. That is not enough to cover even a single payroll. It's not a comfortable place to be. I will be coming to the board probably again next month, as I did last November, asking for the borrowing authority in case we need to do something to get us through January until we start getting our real estate collections in February. That will be the same thing we asked for last year. Last year, luckily, we did not have to use it. We managed to get through January with about $400,000 left in the bank. We're starting in even a more precarious spot this year. If you come out to 15, this number is, that's accurate. Remember the $300,000 that was on the previous slide, that's that. This December amount is probably not going to be negative once we factored in the cuts, because there'll be some cuts that were being done in here that will probably keep that. But this number right here in January, we're really looking at probably, without a levy or cuts, we'd be looking at about $1 million deficit. And that amount of deficit, there is no way to manage around without going forward and borrowing to get through that kind of an issue. And that's probably going to be the case whether we have spending cuts or not, is that will be a significant negative number next January, even after the cuts. And we will no doubt, if the levy does not pass by that point, we will no doubt have to be coming for borrowing and actually doing the borrowing to get us through that period of time.
If the levy passes, what's the timing of collection? Does it help?
The timing of collections, it's actually not going to help us right there. The first collections will come in right here in February of 2014. We'll ask for an advance again in January. There could be a little bit of money from the new levy because I think the bills go out January 20th. So there, could be some people will pay within the first 10 days and there'll be a little bit of money there. Part of the concern I have with this is the new provision that does not allow the 10% and 2.5% rollback on the new levies. I'm concerned that the auditors are not going to be ready to send out the bills and have all the programming done, and I'm concerned that that's going to push back some of the collections because the bill, I haven't heard that the bills will be out that are going to be late, and maybe they won't be, but that is a concern that I do have. So the levy will, it will not help us. It's not going to help us there. Obviously, it will help us out here because we'll have a full year of collections and our balance will be back up to a comfortable level. So we won't have to deal with that kind of shortfall in January of 2015. Okay, enrollment. This is the enrollment projection for the district for the next 5 years going forward. You take a look right now, or at least as of about a week ago, we were at 2,460 students that we are educating the current school year. That is down 22 students from last year. We are anticipating continued drops in our enrollment over the forecast period. The biggest drop is obviously right here. You'll see in a minute why that's the case. Again, it's an 80 student drop next year, and then smaller drops for 3 years after that, but continuing to drop through the forecast period. The reason for that is not because we have more kids moving out of the district than we have coming into the district. This mobility analysis, what this is saying is looking at our average mobility, and this is for kids in grades 1 through 12, so from kindergarten through 11 one year to 1 through 12 the next year. If over the last 3 years we have on average added 37 kids through that. Over the last 5 years we've averaged 47, over the last 10 years 74, although this is still picking up a lot of the Park Trails development from 8, 9, 10 years ago. So we are adding kids every year. We are through mobility, we are adding kids every year. Our problem is what's going on at the bottom and what's going on at the top. You see, last year, we were at 2,482 kids. How did we get, if we added 47 kids, how did we get down 22? And we got down 22 because of this. We had 194 graduating seniors last year. We have a kindergarten class of 125. We are starting the year 69 kids in the hole. We've added 47, so we're net negative 22. Next year, our graduating class right here is the second largest class that we have in the district right now. We are going to be graduating 224 kids. We are right now looking at a kindergarten class next year of 112. So we are starting 112 kids in the hole next year. So again, assuming we add the 47 kids again or something like that, we end up down 80 kids for the year. You see out here, we're still taking in more than we're losing. It's not quite as stark as it was right there. It's similar to what it was last year. And we are looking at that for the 3 years here. And again, if you look at our counts down here, even the following year, again, would be what is then the biggest class that's left. And so we'll probably be doing this until at least that group, for 5 more years beyond the end of this forecast period, unless we start seeing a much more significant pickup in our net migration moving in, and that really would probably take a significant increase in housing construction. Just the transition of people moving in and out of existing homes is not going to drive that many people into the district. It's the new, the 74 kids that we were getting over the 10 years, and think about it, if you look at that, it's 74 kids over 10 years, but the last 5 of those, it's only been 47, because you can think what it must have been the first 5 to average to 74. Yeah, we had been adding over 100 kids a year, and that can only happen through the construction of new homes. And again, yeah, Thomas?
What drives the dynamics in, for example, the high school years from one year to the next of changes in enrollment? Is that based on historically we've
It's
seen
based on our historical trends. Basically, what it does is it takes a look going back, and again, the model lets us do whatever we want to do, but it has a base where you can pick a 3, 5, and 10 year to start with. And what it does is it looks over the last 3 years or 5 years or 10 years. Okay, on average, how many kids moved from 7th grade one year to 8th grade on the next? And that's X percent addition or subtraction, and so it applies that percentage to the most current year 7th graders to project the following year's 8th graders. The method actually works pretty well. It's, in any given grade, you're going to get anomalies. If you remember last year, we had an inordinate number of 7th graders come in. This year, the same thing happened in 2nd grade. So it works pretty well. Again, if you look here, if you remember, we had 2,482 kids last year. When I was doing the forecast back a year and a half ago, I was projecting we were going to end up at 2,484. So we ended up within 2 kids overall of where we had been anticipating. This year, we're actually a little bit higher than where I think I've been projecting we'd end up at about 24, 30, 37 or 47, I think. I don't remember the exact number. I think it was 24, 47, so we ended up about 13 kids ahead of where we were. And that was because of just we have had some pickup in the enrollment, because back when we were doing this in May, we were using the 3-year average. I'm now using the 5 because there has been some pickup in the housing market, and so it looks like we are accelerating a little bit. We're nowhere close to out there still, and I don't anticipate that we will get out there.
I'm formulating a question, but I don't know if I'm ready to ask it, so keep going.
Let me see if this helps. Gives you time to.
So why is enrollment so important in the state funding conversation?
The enrollment is important in the state funding conversation because the new state funding formula is completely driven by two factors, enrollment and relative wealth. And relative wealth is impacted by enrollment. Enrollment, the local share of funding and the state share of funding is now being done on a per pupil basis instead of being done just on the property wealth in the district, which is how it used to be. And so what happens, and we'll get into this a little bit later, what happens is as you start losing pupils, you start getting wealthier, even if nothing is happening in your valuations or in anybody else's. The worst part is you could be doing absolutely nothing. And whatever's going on in the other 613 districts, if they're all doing something different than you're doing, that can be making you wealthier or poorer without anything happening in your district. And so it's a much more dynamic funding system, and there's a lot more movement among districts and among funding. And again, we'll see that a little bit later when we get into that portion of the presentation that looks at state aid. Yes?
So would it be reasonable to conclude that the implication of the new funding formula is that local development is very important, even more important in terms of attracting that new housing growth and attracting the other tax-based participants in the business community?
It's primarily on the commercial side. It's important because gaining commercial value that's got essentially is providing revenue and not providing students is helpful. We also can use some of the students at this point kind of to fill in where we're going. We're not continuing to grow where we're pushing the capacity of our buildings. If anything, we're opening up more capacity in our buildings just because of the demographic movement that's going on right now. So yes, it is, obviously development is a good thing. Whether, low density or high density housing may not be such a good thing. Because with housing, remember that, especially high density housing that's not as high value, the amount of additional revenue you're getting is not covering
What you're spending
to educate
Yep.
the students. So you have, you can have issues there. Other questions about enrollment before we move on? Okay, let's move on to the revenue side. Property tax revenue, the base assumptions. We are coming up on a triennial update in 2014, looking at our data that kind of drive where that is going and conversations I have had with the auditor. I am not forecasting a valuation increase or decrease from the 2014. We're kind of in that range right now where we would be expecting the Department of Taxation to issue a recommendation for a zero increase. So that's what I'm looking at right now. New construction at about 0.75% per year. That had dipped down as low as 0.3 or 0.4% as we went through the worst of the recession and the housing problems. I'm expecting it to grow back very slowly, but nowhere near when we were adding 3 and 4% back when Portrell's was going in. Again, I don't see that kind of development on the horizon to get back up to those kind of levels. Commercial valuation is projected to increase by 8.5% in 2014. That is because the Kendall TIF will be ending. Technically, it will end at the end of this year, but with the property tax being paid in arrears, so there'll still be 2 more payments that we get in lieu of taxes during calendar year 14. But for tax year 14, the Kendall property that has been exempt will become taxable. And so essentially what will happen is the revenue that we get from that property will move from being payments in lieu of taxes to part of our regular property tax collections, beginning with the February 2015 settlements that we start taking in.
But there won't really be any net change in revenue because of that. 'Cause it's just
There may be, but they'll be minor. It's minor. It's actually probably a net small loss to the operating, because right now all the pilot money goes into operating, but as taxes, some of it will go into bond money. So essentially it's a wash. So no, it's not going to be a major issue. The public utility property in the district is expected to grow 3.5% a year. Keep in mind that is only 2% of the valuation in the district. So while it is growing, we are getting some additional money. It's not a huge amount of money in the scope of our budget.
Approximately, what's the commercial property valuation percentage of the overall district?
The overall is about 15% of real property. Probably about 13% of overall property. If we take a look at our total revenue 3 years back, current 3 years forward, what you'll see is real estate has gone from 59% of our revenue up to 62 and projected to go up to 63. This is without having, remember, this is without having a tax increase in there. It's still going up, and the reason it's going up is not because it's growing by that much. It's going up because some of the other things have gone away. If you look back in 11, tangible personal property, well, that's about the same. The property tax allocation, which included our rollbacks for tangible personal property that are now gone. That was 11% back in 11. It's now 9% because of the tangible personal property reimbursements going away. And restricted aid, which is money that was through the Education Jobs Program and the supplemental money that was coming from the federal government. There was still some of that in 11. That's now down to 0. And so essentially what has happened is that money has moved over to, made real estate a bigger percentage by that happening. And you look going forward, real estate fairly stable with what it has been over the 2014. The property tax revenue, and again, Thomas, this gets back to the question you asked a little bit ago. Residential property and agricultural together are 88% of our taxes. Commercial and industrial are only 10% of the taxes that we get. Compared to 12 years ago, residential was 77%. So it's gone up 6% over the last 12 years. And that's because of the elimination of the tangible personal property tax. That has gone away, and all that revenue, all that liability is shifted onto residential taxpayers. And then the public utility has gone down from 3 to 2 slightly, and that's making up the 6% increase in residential. Everything else is the same as it was 12 years ago.
Can you just mention what the tangible personal property tax is? Because we haven't talked about that in a while.
The tangible personal property was a tax on businesses on their essentially property that's machinery, equipment, inventories, things that are not part of the building. So if you take, like if this room, in here, the chairs, the tables, that would be tangible personal property. The walls, the floor is real property. It's affixed, it's part of the real property.
So it's basically considering that things like the desk or a piece of machinery as a kind of capital, right?
That was really the minor piece of it. You go into a Ford plant, for say, all that equipment that's being used to build the cars.
So it's kind of capital there.
It's capital, yeah. It's basically, it's property that's not affixed to the building, that you can pick up. Well, it might be hard to pick up a Ford manufacturing machine, but essentially something you could literally, if you could do it, haul it out, move it to the next factory, attach it, plug it in, and off you go. That's what's tangible property. That was phased out by the state over 4 years, from 2006 through 2009. And so so 12 years ago, and again, we were, it was 5% of our value. We were not a huge tangible personal property based district. There were some that were very big, where the tangible property alone was well over 50% of the total value. Okay, you go to a place that has, where it's really an industrial place that has a small population, and you would find that. Again, it was not a huge amount of money here, but it's enough money that when the reimbursements for it went away, we did lose $700 and some thousand over 2 years. So it was a significant enough piece of money when the reimbursements for it went away.
And shifts the burden obviously onto
And it
the
shifted the
residential.
burden on to all the remaining taxpayers, and primarily because the vast majority of our remaining taxpayers are residential, because we don't have a large commercial base, that's where it shifted most of the burden.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, new state funding formula. We had a kind of a lengthier discussion at last meeting, so I will not recap all of that. What I do want to show you, and this really gets at the issue we were talking about earlier, with how your relative wealth changes things. This is from the September presentation. So back in September, I was estimating our state share index for the current year and next year at about 33.2%, meaning of base aid, 1/3 of it was going to come from the state and 2/3 of it was going to come from our taxpayers. And then in 16 and 17, that was assumed to drop from 33 to 31.3, so about 2 percentage points. In the interim, after discussions with other treasurers and looking at some of the assumptions we were making, we kind of felt that the assumption we were making for the valuation per pupil statewide, not in Granville, statewide, was probably too high. It was probably, when you look at the 3-year rolling average that this uses, we realized what was coming off was a relatively high year and going to be replaced by a relatively low year. And so that average was going to come down, and we were probably using too high an average. Just by lowering that, and I lowered the average, I think, from $142,000 per pupil to $138,000 per pupil. So just lowering the statewide average by $4,000 per pupil, it did this to our state share index. This year is actually a tiny bit even higher than it was before. It's 33.6 instead of 0.2. But look at where it becomes in 15 and 16. It's dropping a full 4 percentage points now instead of 2. And that was simply because not anything that I did with our assumption in Granville, but the assumption I made at the state level. That state level assumption caused us to become essentially 2% wealthier in the eyes of the state and lower the percentage of aid we're getting from the state from 33.6 down to 29.6. And then in 17, we're assuming another 1.5% drop down to just about 28 in 18. The reason it's moving in steps like that is current state law, which only governs the first 2 years, says whatever the state share percentage is at the end of 2013-14 school year, it's the same in 14-15. So we're kind of assuming at this point that the law is going to stay the same, and it's going to recalculate for 15 and 16, stay the same, and then recalculate again in 17, 18. If it recalculates every year, all that's going to happen is this number right here is going to be somewhere between those two numbers. So it'll be somewhere between 29.6 and 28.1 if it recalculates. So what is that doing to us? Right now, the funding formula, the growth is capped, and there's a floor. The cap is saying that we cannot grow by 6.25% or more than 6.25% from what we got last year.
Wealth? Our wealth?
No, the amount of revenue we get from the state can only go up by 6.25%. What the state formula is telling us is our Formula 8, if it was fully funded, would be $6.1 million. Last year, we got a little under $5.2 million. So we are capped at this amount. That's a 6% growth, which means essentially there is $641,000 the state says it owes us that it is not funding this year. Next year, you actually look and our total formula aid actually drops a little bit from this year, and that's because of the loss in students. Now, it doesn't change our percentage, but it does change the number of students that each dollar amount per student gets multiplied by. There's a 10.5% growth cap based on the prior year. That amount is $6,062,000. Right now, that's projected to be slightly above. The $11,000 is, essentially right at the cap. That a movement of just a couple kids one way or the other will move us, could move us off the cap. And so we're going to go ahead and get 2 years of pretty substantial growth. We're still going to be well behind where we were back before the recession started, but we're getting substantial growth. The problem is what happens out here. If we assume that this is still going to be the guarantee, that $5,164,000, that means that's the amount of money we can't get below. When I run the formulas with our 29.6% state share index, I calculate that we're going to be a little under $5.5 million. That, of course, is still higher than that number, which means we are formula funded because we don't have to worry about a cap because that cap's going up and we're going down, but we're also not to there. And so you see, from here to here, we're losing $600,000. From here to here, we're gaining $600,000. Essentially what the state is saying, you're underfunded by $640,000 here, we're going to give it to you next year, and the next year say, oh, by the way, now you're overfunded by $600,000, and we're going to take it back away from you. It's a little perplexing how that happens. Well, it's not. I've seen the formulas. I know how it happens. It's not necessarily logical why it happens. I get we're losing enrollment. The problem is that loss is compounding by making us wealthier, and so not only do we lose money for the kids we're losing, we lose money for the kids we're still educating as well. And that kind of compounds. We actually go, whoops, I didn't mean the wrong button. We actually go up slightly in 16-17 because, again, the state share percentages are frozen, and the assumed growth in the formula aid is higher. The percent growth is actually a little bit higher than our loss in enrollment, so we do go up a little. But then again, we go back down, and this number right here, that $5.2 million, is still higher than our guarantee amount. And so basically, unless this guarantee is allowed to move forward and keep up, I'm projecting by 17-18, we are going to be back to about $95,000 higher than we were in 13 and 14. All that additional money that they're giving us between there and there is all but $95,000 of that will go away by the time we get to 2018 under the assumptions that are built into the forecast. And that's why that guarantee is so important in figuring out what's going to happen to our to our aid and to our budget. If we look real quickly at our history for state aid, again, this is our unrestricted grants and aid. You see it dropping, coming back up, dropping. So again, by 2018, we're going to be at a level that's lower than it was in 2009. And the 2009, on top of this, there was money from the federal government that was adding on to what we were getting from the state because of the recession. If we look at our property tax allocation, the other big area from the state, you see we peaked in 2011 when the tangible personal property tax reimbursements were at their maximum. You see the drop in the tangible personal property tax reimbursements over 2 years. And so by the time we get out to 2018, we are $500,000 lower than we were in 2011 as far as this money coming from the state as well. Questions about revenues before we do expenditures and finish up. Okay, expenditure assumptions. Beginning next year and going forward, there is money set aside to cover negotiated salaries and step increases. To assume that will be zero is probably pretty irresponsible. We are going to have to negotiate. We will have to give raises to our staff. Again, you know, the levy not passing may influence what we can give. But you know, it would not be responsible to assume we're not going to do that. Our health insurance. We have had some very high utilization rates over the last years of our health insurance. I'm expecting our premiums to grow by 25% next year from this year. The reason is because we were able to negotiate a cap of 12% this year, what that saved us was, because of our utilization rates, without the cap, we'd have gone out by 29% this year over last year. Essentially what that means is we are starting essentially 17% in the hole. That we are being subsidized by the insurance carrier by 17%. We will rebid the insurance again going into next spring and going into next year, but that utilization rate is not going to help us when it's time to bid, because everyone is going to see that as they're preparing their bids. And so while we may be able to control that a little bit in the bidding process, I'm not optimistic that we're going to be able to control it a lot. Obviously, reducing either of these, the amount we have in there aside for increases in salaries, or if we are able to get through negotiations, if we get any restructuring of what the health insurance looks like, obviously any of that savings, be it below what is forecast currently, would contribute towards what we would have to do for cuts and lower the amount that we would have, the other cuts that we would have to make. Expenditures, again, 3 years back, 3 years forward. Salaries over the next 3 years are expected to be a smaller portion of our total spending, even with salary negotiated increases. Part of that is because is the increase in health insurance. That is driving the cost of benefits from 24% of our spending up to 28% of our spending, and that's really where most of that is going. Why that is going down as a percentage of spending. The problem is it's not that this is going down, it's that this is going up faster, making that a smaller percentage. Staffing levels, these are the projected staffing levels through the 5-year forecast period. You will see slight declines in it, probably through attrition over the whole period as we adjust to our enrollment going down. If our enrollment continues to drop, we will need fewer teachers. Because of the unique way our enrollment dropping, it is not a one-to-one relationship. But we are anticipating adjusting our staffing going forward. We do have a little bit of staffing increase from last year to this year. Some of that we've already talked about with the 3 people that we have brought back onto staff who are not, who are being paid other ways. And you see the other pieces in here of where those came from. They were all demand for services driven. Partly through state mandates, partly through some other adjustments that we made. But because of demand for services, we did have some small increases in a couple places. Final slide, again, this just looks at each of our 4 major sources, 5 years back, 5 years forward, and you can see the pattern over that period. You see there's personnel, there's the significant cuts that we made going into the last school year. And then you see a corresponding benefit drop right there. You can see we have tried to restrain our purchase services. Part of that going up is outside of our things that are outside of our control. Those were driven by higher deductions from the state for our ESC, for our community school kids, and from the increase in electric from AEP that was passed by PUCO last fall contributed to that. And you can see where we've continued to cut back on our use of supplies and materials. We can cut back only so far. You know, eventually you end up at a base level that you have to spend every year. And so what we have is just inflationary increases there through the forecast period. So with that, I will stop. I will be happy to answer any questions that anyone might have.
Mike, can you just, the loss of students versus the loss of state aid, it's not, it doesn't equate.
It does not equate.
So help me understand.
Roughly, the loss of students from 2014 to 2016 is about 6%. The loss in state aid over the same period is about 10%. And so you get that compounding effect in that we're losing not only for the students we're losing, but that's causing us then to lose for the students that we are continuing to educate as well.
Because I think that's an important point, that when people see the declining enrollment, it's really affecting a vast majority of our revenue stream from the state.
Yes, it is.
So, you know, we are going to try and live and adjust staffing as we lose students, but, you know, if we lose 20 students, it might be across K-12. So it's not like you can potentially say, okay, now I need one less third grade teacher because we've lost 20 students. But I think that notion that it drops our state aid more than the potential loss of enrollment,
Yes.
has a greater impact than most people understand.
But it also, it affects not only our basic amount, but a lot of the other pieces of the formula are driven by the same factor.
Right.
So like the amount that we get to educate special ed kids. When we become wealthier, as the state is measuring us, we get less money to educate special ed kids. And we could lose 80 kids because of the 12th graders going out and the kindergartners coming in, and we may not lose a single special ed kid. We may have the exact same number of special ed kids that we're educating next year as we're educating this year, but the state will be taking money away from us, well, not next year, but the year after. The state will be taking money away from us, not because we've have fewer kids to educate in special education, but because we are perceived wealthier and can afford to pay more of that money out of our local taxes than the state, even though from a pure valuation standpoint, we will be, I'm anticipating, very minimally wealthier over those 2 years, and most of that driven by the switch of the Kendall TIF, which isn't generating any additional revenue for us. It's just adding valuation and just changing how we're getting that revenue.
Does the funding formula also, piggybacking on what Jeff is saying, create a cycle of coming back for levies more rapidly because of that disjuncture?
Yeah, and a lot, again, it's all going to be driven by the guarantee. And we saw that in the one graph. If the guarantee is 2013, we will no doubt be back on the ballot sooner than if the guarantee is a moving prior year. Because it's a difference of $1.8 million over 3 years that would mean for the district, and there's a difference between having a reasonably healthy balance in 2018 and having a balance that is, frankly unacceptable in 2018. And so the formula is driving that, as is whatever the state is going to use as a guarantee.
Next, we have Mr. Dilbone, who is going to talk a little bit about policy updates.
twice a year, we also update our policies. I will tell you that the General Assembly has been working extremely hard in creating updates for our board policies. And I say that a little tongue-in-cheek from the standpoint of typically in a policy update conversation, we have maybe 10 to 12 policies that have changed. In this current change of policy or updating of policy, we have 35 changes that took place in the last 6 months, basically, from the General Assembly. I'm going to tell you right now, this folder is full of new pending legislation from the General Assembly, all related to schools. So I serve on the legislative committee for BASA, and so we had our meeting last week to determine what we would like to oppose and potentially support. And what I fear, and this is a little bit of an editorial, so please forgive me, but what I fear is when we do policy on the quick at the state level, we don't necessarily understand the implications to districts. So it's important to recognize the impact of legislation that's being passed. So what we do is we go through a process and we utilize OSBA, who manages our board policies documents. And we work with Mr. Dillbone and different departments to put together the policies based on the recommended changes from the General Assembly. So with that being said, Mr. Dillbone is going to do the first reading of roughly 35, I believe, policies. He's not going to read all. Chuck almost fell over. Did you see that?
So did I. No, I piggyback on Jeff's comments because you'll see that many of these policies we did last year because it has made a few changes. We have to redo them again and probably be doing them again. So I'm just going to quickly I sent you a summary and again, there's so many policies. Sometimes we just do a one reading and we go through, but there's just so many. I'm sure you're going to need a couple months to look at these. But the first set of policies deals with evaluations, and basically it's changing the word proficient to skilled in the rating system, and it's also changing the number of days that the students have that would count towards your student academic growth. Business Advisory Council is pretty clear. They suggest or ask that you do a Business Advisory Council, which I think we have one through the county group. Executive session, you now have another reason, go into executive session for economic development. Takes away the next policy deals with the use of school buses and what is considered to be non-routine. They used to list in the state law exactly what was non-routine. Now it's up to the board to decide that. And there are some suggestions in the policy for that. Data retention, which Mike deals with data retention. I'm not going to go through it. There's a whole bunch of changing in the dates and stuff like that. So it's really his dealing with that. He's in charge of data retention for our school system. The check, a criminal check, records check, you could, in circumstances, just do an FBI check instead of a BCI check. It depends on different circumstances now. Family medical leave, there are changes here to help our district administer family medical leave. It protects us on handling the many different issues, and there's a lot of good policy updates to this one, I believe. Compensation and for contracts changes the timeline in which a teacher has to be notified if it will be non-renewed. It used to be April 30th, now it's June 1, which that date has been changed. The hiring of the professional staff, if the superintendent has a person who might create a conflict of interest that would like to be hired, they can designate another person to make that recommendation instead of the superintendent, which I think is a fair policy. The reading is, we had reading last time, the reading skills, and they made some more changes to this. It's changing what the passing and assessment dealing with. It's modifying who can help a student who has a deficiency, and it also gives you some other options you can use for students who have a reading deficiency.
I believe the third grade guarantee will also, you'll see another iteration in this current round of proposed legislation. Again, they did it quickly, not necessarily understanding the implications to other laws and the way schools operate.
A big change in extracurricular activities deals with schools, non-public schools, and homeschool students. So now with non-public schools, if we're offering a sport at a non-public school such as Greenville Christian, say in our kids might be going to school, it lives in our district, swimming would be an example. They could then participate on our swim team. We cannot charge them. They have to follow the same academic rules, the same, all the eligibility rules. If we're charging our swimmer something, then they could be charged the same amount, but we can't charge them anymore. And the same with homeschool students. The mission of non-resident students is dealing with grandparents, power of attorney. It changes for early entrance to kindergarten. It changes the dates there, and also it does not have to follow acceleration policy if you are early, want to do early entrance to kindergarten. It's changed some of those rules.
Do our homeschool students that participate in athletics pay an activity fee? As
Yes.
the students do?
They would
You
pay
pay
an
an activity or participation
Correct.
fee if those are correct.
And just for the board's perspective, there is a provision in law that would allow non-resident students to participate. We have elected to say, no, we don't do open enrollment. We would not allow non-resident students to participate in athletics. So it's strictly resident, either homeschool or non-public. Okay?
The tobacco policies, there are 4 policies that deal with tobacco, and this actually didn't come from state law. This came from the Licking County Health Department, who asked us to come in and review our policies, which we were more than willing to let them do that. They thought we had strong policies, but they suggested a few little tweaks to make them even stronger, which we agreed with, and that's why those are in this change. Student fees, we're still allowed to withhold records and so forth if they haven't paid their fees, except for if it's a court order, which only makes common sense. You wouldn't hold student fees with a situation like that. Same way with the student records, with FERPA and so forth. Basically dealing if you have a court order or custody situation, those would be involved. And then the booster groups, and under certain circumstances, they could be required to do a charitable trust, creation of charitable trust under certain circumstances. So basically, that's it in a nutshell. And again, if you have questions, you can ask them tonight. But probably you'll have to do research more to go back. Feel free to email me or Jeff.
One that you didn't reference, it was adding sexual orientation to
Oh,
our
that's right.
equal employment opportunity policy as well. So I think that was in a document that we sent.
Does the booster groups meet for a charitable organization back in any of our current booster groups, or what was that?
No, most of our booster groups have already been complying with that $25,000 threshold. So it really is just a trigger that they have to do work on their end from a reporting perspective. If is that accurate? Okay. I believe that's an IRS rule on charitable donations.
Hopefully they're aware of this as well, and I'm not sure which booster groups it would even apply to, but I don't want to blindside them with something if there's a way we can do that.
Right, with all these
Yeah.
policies, when there are changes, and we update like the principals and everybody know, okay, here's what's coming down the pipe.
We've sent at least the athletic boosters and the music boosters for sure information related to this.
Okay, thank you.
So again, this is a first reading. Any questions or concerns you send to Chuck or myself, and then in November, we will approve those policies and change them in the online version of our board policies under your tab on the website.
Public comments. Is there anyone who would like to address the board? If so, please come on up, introduce yourselves. I'm see no inclination whatsoever. Okay, board reports.
Just a couple of things from CTEC. We're meeting next week to talk about the changes to board governance and how we appoint to that board. Most likely, we'll be able to still continue to use one of us, but there have been some changes. So we're meeting with council next week to really understand what our options are there. And then at the end of September was sophomore open house, and they had about 200 students show up to look at their programs and meet with teachers and see the labs and things like that. So I meant to find out what an incoming class was, but that's, you know, they have competition. People do get rejected from programs that are really popular. So there is an application process involved in some of those. So, but they had a very successful open house at the end of September. In terms of policy, you saw from Jeff's rather large file that there's lots going on, but the one thing that we're really keeping an eye on at the moment is House Bill 237, which is a bill to repeal implementing the Common Core, of which, of course, we've spent the past 2 years preparing for. Under this legislation or this bill, it would void any prior action taken to adopt or implement the Common Core. It would prohibit the state board from using the PARC assessments or other assessments related to or based on the Common Core. It would require that the state board hold a hearing in each congressional district in the state before adopting or revising any academic content standards. And then interesting, and maybe you know a little bit more about this, it states that no school district or school may be required to use statewide academic standard as a condition for approval to operate and receive state funds. So how?
That was directly related to the Race to the Top initiative.
So we won't be.
Because there were contingencies stipulated in that grant process that you had to agree to certain changes.
So that won't.
I'm going to go ahead.
No, I was going to say. So, you know, the OSBA has asked us to write letters to our state reps. I will draft a letter and share, so you can either take from it or, you know, also contact our state reps. But if you want to talk about more about what it means to us.
From my perspective, there are two things that I really want to get across. The first is the Common Core is in reading and math, and it was a state initiative. It was not a federal initiative, and it was driven to provide some continuity between states so we could have some type of comparable data when we look from state to state from a performance perspective. The other thing is we have spent, like you said, 2.5 years building for this change to a college and career readiness benchmark. I don't think anybody argues that we want to have a more rigorous set of expectations for our students. We do not want to live under the current minimum competency standards. And so the amount of money that we've invested in professional development, time, resources, the Math and Focus adoption was over $100,000. We've done a lot of building to make this transition smooth, knowing that we're going to a different readiness benchmark. And I think that's an important aspect to not forget, because I think, unfortunately, things can be politicized, and I think this is one of those issues. We want to make sure that we keep our eye on outcomes for students and better outcomes for students in aggregate.
Are we receiving much in the way of comments or questions from the community, specifically from parents, about Common Core and what it means and what the implications are?
Not necessarily. We've done a couple of proactive communications to the community, but I'd be hard pressed to say that I've received more than 3. And more of it is related to, well, what's the issue? I'm hearing about this in the media, and so tell me a little bit more about it, not necessarily negative comments.
I guess I share your views on the on the
Be kind.
legislation.
No,
I think it's idiotic and uninformed, and ill-advised. And to me, we should always be talking about increasing the rigor and raising the bar. And I think we've done that here. I think it's being done elsewhere, and I think it should continue. So I guess I would encourage you and the administration to continue your outreach to the community to make sure that folks are informed of what it means, because I think that the opposition is largely a political opposition as opposed to a fact-based opposition. And I would like to think that our state legislature would make fact-based decisions. But I think it would make sense for the community to be better informed. So maybe that means at some point holding a forum, continue to communicate in every way possible to let people know what Common Core actually is.
Yeah, and I think the more kind of you personalize a little to what we're doing, Granville's, I think, move to the Common Core is not the end in itself, right? We're looking to increase the performance of our students overall against a number of benchmarks. This just happens to be the context of one way that we're going to measure it, right? So I think if we can kind of personalize that a little bit and say, and we're not just moving the Common Core because other people are, and we're increasing the rigor of our curriculum because that's important to do. This happens to be more tools, and we're building that curriculum to meet with that. I think that can be a very well-received message, right? It resonates very well with folks here in the local community, regardless of what happens in the greater political context. So the more we can personalize the great things that we're doing, I think the more it will be supported.
Thomas said it more nicely than I did. I'm just grouchy.
Well, I'm going to be grouchy here too, because Dr. Corman said it very politely, that the governance for the joint vocational schools, that changed in legislation. I want to be very clear, that actually came out of conference committee. It did not get vetted in the House or Senate. It was done in conference committee and not vetted by any political group except for that committee. So again, I caution the General Assembly in making decisions that have not been fully vetted. And this is one where, I think Dr. Corman's representation on the CTEC board has been advantageous in many ways. And I think we have a great school in our backyard in CTEC. And we want to continue to have a relationship with them that is mutually beneficial. So, again, I just wanted to highlight that one aspect.
Just the head of the Senate Education Committee is opposed to this legislation. So do we have a sense of how? Yeah, and Stapleton. He's the House. Okay, but they're both opposed to this legislation. So I think it's important that they hear our voices, that we are opposed to it as well. But I'm wondering if you've heard anything about how strong, or what's the likelihood of passage, or what's the.
We believe it will be opposed by just about every major educational group, and we're not hearing that we're hearing they need to hear from the locals. We've been very effective in communicating ill-advised, abandoning ill-advised legislation in the past, and so we're going to continue that perspective. Thank you.
Yep. That's all I got.
Nothing to report on North Granville.
The Granville Education Foundation met last week. They will be having a fall fundraising that will be after the levy this year, so that the community and the groups, and we can all stay focused on levy fundraising as needed in support of that. But one other initiative I'll mention that is starting to percolate up through the Education Foundation is a desire to connect with alumni more effectively. And I don't think our district has a real effective mechanism that we stay in touch with alumni through ongoing communications and so forth, and even groups to get back together for parades and so forth. And also as supporters of the district, the GEF sees them as potential donors and supporters, because many other school districts have very effective alumni programs. Just keep those folks engaged in the community as they move around elsewhere. So that's something that's just starting in its infancy as a potential source of revenue for the GEF. But I think more importantly, looking at is just, how do we keep Granville alumni connected to our school district and our community? So we're reaching out to alumni to see if there's ways that, organization or find ways to stay in touch.
It seems to me as though that question has come up before, and there are, in fact.
Maybe there are, we need to just find one. What's your thoughts?
There are a lot.
There are mechanisms by which alumni are being, I
Yeah.
don't want to say tracked.
Contacted, contacted, yes. I think they're looking at more of a systematic approach for, a long-term relationship and really a conduit to share information about the district
Mhm.
long-term.
Mhm.
That's their goal.
Is there anything does the school district now to connect with alumni in any regular way?
We do at some level for the 4th of July parade, but it really is dependent on that class
Mhm.
and that class president and some of the outreach that they do individually. So I think it's an area that we could probably improve upon from a district perspective. But I think working with some of the support organizations like GEF would be a good avenue to pursue that, because we don't necessarily have the time, money, or effort to do that communication on a regular basis. But through social media and through other means, there are a lot of ways to connect.
Jeff, do you want to?
Barb Helwig has been keeping a database
Yeah.
of all the alumni in my class, so I think she's probably pretty up to date. With the Gateway.
The Granville Foundation met last week. They're going into the nominating process to add some new members to replace some that are rotating off, but apart from that.
Not to step back, but just one thing that will likely come back to this board is an approval of the trustees of the Granville Education Foundation based on read or a look at the IRS regulations governing charitable organizations. They feel it's important that the supported organization, school board, accept and approve or nominate even the members of the trustees of the Granville Education Foundation. So I believe that our organizational meeting in January will actually be approving, which in the past we have not as.
Well, we've approved my representation on that board and a board member's representation on that board, but their suggestion was to have an agenda item that basically said, these are our list of trustees, please approve. Because they are a direct support agency or organization, I guess. That's better.
So, but, and at the time, when you're looking at the background of those trustees and so forth, I think we're happy to have them all join us, and it's a great group.
Levy? The ACES organization, under the really energetic leadership of Leanne and Eric Miller and Emma and Chris Butler, is continuing to work tirelessly throughout the community. Their fundraising efforts have been successful. They're continuing to try and raise funds for ongoing support, but they've been able to get their message out. Over 350 yard signs, I think is the number.
A little bit over.
Yeah. They ran out of yard signs and had a demand for more, so that was a nice indication of interest and amongst folks in the community. I know that they are in the final stages of putting together an endorsement program to be published before the election, and they've had great support for that. They are going door to door over the next couple of weekends in selected areas and looking for volunteers to support that effort. And I know everybody here has been engaged in outreach in the community. I know they appreciate that. They are meeting, the committee meets on a weekly basis and continue to meet probably more frequently than that as we get into the last 2 weeks of the election. But you know, the enthusiasm, the organization, the tremendous commitment from so many people in that group and the committee chairs and the subcommittee chairs has really been impressive, and I'm quite pleased and thrilled with the job that they've done.
The publication, the most recent one, I thought was very nicely done.
The mail?
the mailer that just came out about a few days ago.
There'll be one more yet before then.
There will be.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, that takes us to our action agenda, and I am actually going to bounce back and forth between the agenda and the addendum. So I'll make sure that I read the action item lines specifically. We have 9.01, maternity leave and paternity leave for 2 employees, leave of absence.
So moved.
Mr. Jennings,
Aye.
Mr. Miller,
Aye.
Dr. Montel,
Aye.
Dr. Corman,
Aye.
Ms. Dees.
Aye. Thank you.
We have one approval of a leave of absence, 9.02, and we do not have an ending date for that leave of absence at this point.
So moved. Second.
Mr. Miller,
Aye.
Mr. Jennings,
Aye.
Dr. Corman,
Aye.
Dr. Montel,
Aye.
Ms. Dees.
Aye. Thank you.
9.03 is actually on the addendum sheet. The one in the actual agenda is incorrect. So it is the approval of overnight field trips. We have 2, the high school band going to Orlando and the orchestra going to Chicago.
So moved.
Second?
Mr. Jennings,
Aye.
Dr. Corman,
Aye.
Dr. Montel,
Aye.
Mr. Miller,
Aye.
Ms. Dees.
Aye. Thank you.
Action item 9.04 is an annual contract that we approve with Kindred Rehab Services. This is an as-needed contract for occupational physical therapy or speech services. By signing a contract with them, we get a better rate if we need their services. We do believe that we're staffed appropriately at this time, but it's an as-needed contract.
So moved.
Second?
Mr. Miller,
Aye.
Dr. Montel,
Aye.
Mr. Jennings,
Aye.
Dr. Corman,
Aye.
Ms. Dees.
Aye. Thank you.
9.05 is one that I'm going to ask for a motion and then discuss a little bit. The Columbia Gas of Ohio easement agreement.
So moved.
Second?
Okay. This easement agreement is for an easement in the front of the Middle School, High School complex. It is part of a Denison project to create a compressed natural gas power source. And so you probably noticed some of the Columbia Gas trucks even on East College Street. This is our part in being a good neighbor, so to speak, of helping them create this line so that they can do their project for compressed natural gas. What it does is gives them the easement to put in an 8-inch or less pipe. We have it written so that it is one line only. But it does, it is them potentially having the ability to, utilize our land to maintain and update that line with specific requirements. It does cross our driveway, and so they would, I believe, if I'm correct, and Chuck, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but they would actually go under our driveway for that aspect of the project. And we would be compensated in the area of $4,500 for that agreement. With that, I believe every board member has a copy of that agreement.
And Jeff, you indicated that the fire department has looked at this also.
Yes.
Chief Hussey
has looked at this and said that he is comfortable with that, with the placement of that line and what that line is going to be doing.
And legal counsel has also,
Legal counsel has reviewed this document.
So they're replacing their coal burning power heating facility with natural gas or supplementing? Is that?
I think they're looking for supplementing their options for compressed natural gas in the future. I know that, I don't want to speak for Denison, but I believe that they've had issues with that power plant, and they're looking at exploring most of their options related to compressed natural gas in the future, which is a cleaner burn.
And it's also part of their sustainability,
Yeah.
overall sustainability plan.
Chuck, do you have anything else? Okay.
And this is immediately adjacent to a roadway? So this will go right between the path and the roadway roughly? I can't quite tell where the.
I'm sorry, I was listening to.
So the location of the easement or the pipeline will likely between the roadway and the existing path, or is it further?
It's actually further,
But it's right along the path, but it'd be on the pool side of the path.
Right.
There's not enough tall trees there and everything, but there's too many
Oh, I
trees
see.
between the path and the roadway. So just be following right along the bike path.
So there's nothing else there?
No.
and there are connections already at certain locations that they're tying into.
Compressed natural gas can also be used for gas powered vehicles.
That has been a conversation in the past.
Well, I think they want to power some of the other things that they use on campus too.
Mr. Miller,
Aye.
Dr. Rentel,
Aye.
Dr. Corman.
Aye.
Mr. James,
Aye.
Ms. Dees.
Thank you. 9.06 is a resolution of transportation deemed impractical. I'm going to bring you back to a board meeting ago where we deemed a couple of transportation routes impractical due to the length or not to the length, but to the number of students that were being requested to transport. We entered into a negotiation with both sets of parents. We have resolution 2.1, and that is attached. So this is their payment in lieu of transportation agreement.
Second. So is the other one still in discussion?
Still in discussion.
Mr. Miller,
Aye.
Dr. Rentel,
Aye.
Mr. Denise,
Aye.
Dr. Corman.
Aye.
Ms. Dees.
That brings us into our consent agenda. 10.01A through C7. And I'll give you a couple of highlights once I get a motion.
So moved.
Second.
Okay. One thing that I would like to clarify is the cash donation of $6,000 from the PTO is for the GIS book group, not library. And it's that continuation of their auction monies funding for development. So we have donation of cash to the choir, the Brady Commission for their performance at Granville Experience, and the PTO donation. The one thing that I'd like to call to your attention is last year we hired Roy Gottschalk, who was a part-time high school clinic nurse, and she is moving. So she has resigned her position, and we have that position posted. So I definitely recommend that with appreciation of her service to our students at the Granville High School.
Mr. Miller,
Aye.
Dr. Rentel,
Aye.
Dr. Corman,
Aye.
Mr. Denise.
Aye.
Ms. Dees.
consent, and now to the finance portion of the meeting.
The first item is the monthly report for the month of September. The motion is a very, very brief.
So moved.
Second.
Somebody else got a big one. It is a very short report since you heard from me enough tonight about where we are. There really are only two issues that threw off where we were expecting to be. We have had an issue with the posting of fee money to the right place to pay for it. It was messed up for August and most of September. We realized the problem. We have feverishly been reversing and getting it into the correct places. It is partially corrected in the September and is now fully corrected. So the October will reflect all of that. It was a programming error on the part of Pay For It that we probably let go longer than we should have, but we did catch it and we have corrected it. The other side is on the spending side, there was a billing mix-up through EMS, who does our maintenance and custodial work, so that we ended up not getting the bill and paying it in September, and so we will be having September and October's bills in October, caught up at the end of the month. And the explanations from, why relative to last year are all things that we have talked about in the past. There's nothing new in there. So that is the extent of the financial report. Questions? Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Dr. Ringo?
Aye.
Mr. Denise?
Aye.
Dr. Corman?
Aye.
Ms. Leeds? 11.02 is the permanent appropriation resolution for the 2013-2014 fiscal year. Again, if I could get a motion.
So moved.
Second.
You will see there are only small adjustments from the preliminary appropriation that was done back at the June meeting. The general operating appropriation is identical to where it was. We are well within where we expect it to be. The only major difference is the district agency fund, which is the Randall Community Authority. For some reason, I had not appropriated high enough for the projects we're doing. The other thing, the federal grants have all been adjusted based on what we know to be our current allocations. And then we have added a $45,000 appropriation for UC miscellaneous federal grant. That is the funding for the GIS land. Obviously, in May, we did not be doing that. And so we have added an appropriation on to do that project. Questions about the permanent appropriation? Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Dr. Ringo?
Aye.
Dr. Corman?
Aye.
Mr. Janice?
Aye.
Ms. Deeds?
Aye.
Thank you. 11.03 is the formal adoption and instructions for me to file the 5-year forecast with the state.
Second.
I believe we've discussed this. And I would assume that you have asked all questions. If you have questions, that's fine.
So I was going to commend you. It's a very thorough document, very well put together. Highlights the challenges that we're facing, that the community is facing, and I think does so in a way that's very well organized, very fact-based, and so I think it's good document and one that
Thank you.
we should operate from.
I will tell you, this is the formal document. There are a set of notes that go with it. I will be sending the notes around to everybody tomorrow. I just finished drafting them up today to take a look at. Jeff has been through them. We are both comfortable with them. Probably in the next day or two, if you have any concerns or comments about the notes, I do need to submit this by the end of next week. So if you can get back to me in the next day or two about the notes, if you have any just concerns. Mostly, the notes are just laying out the assumptions that went into each of the line items that's on the 5-year forecast. I don't think you will see anything in there that we have not discussed either tonight or in other forums. Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Mr. Janice?
Aye.
Dr. Corman?
Aye.
Dr. Rentel?
Aye.
Ms. Deeds?
Aye.
Thank you. 11.04 is a creation of, for lack of a better word, GIS Music Activity Fund. Essentially, this is a club-like thing. Mrs. Hartman, the GIS music instructor, asked, she has students coming in during open periods, and they call it kind of honors choir, and they do singing, and they'd like to at some point do performances, but they would like to be able to raise some money for little prizes and for things like that. And in discussing what they're doing, I think the cleanest way it seemed to do that was to go ahead and create the fund, create a fund just like any other activity fund, which will allow them then to allow a budget to move forward with what they're trying to do. This is all a during school project, so there's no supplemental involved. This is just during her open periods and the students' open periods that this is going to occur.
So moved. Do we motion for motion?
Sorry, I'm going to ask for a motion.
So moved.
Second.
So is this the same way we handle other clubs and things like that?
It is. Yeah, the clubs have to be formally approved by the board. If they're gonna be able to raise and spend money, they have to have formal board approval to exist so that we can give them their own funding code. So that
Last year, if you remember, I'm gonna slaughter the name, but the Builders Club at the middle school, Jana Van Dyke, is that what it's called? Builders Club, yeah. We did a similar approval for their activity fund.
it is required by board policy.
And the income to this fund will be from donations.
And it'll be fund donations, or they may do little fundraisers that will have to follow the guidelines of, board policy. Yeah, there's no funding coming from the district. It will be like any other, what we call 200 student activity account. It will operate just the same as any other of the student activity accounts operate.
I think that we've got a staff member that's stepping up to this and which one of them, so that's great.
Okay. Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Dr. Rentel?
Aye.
Dr. Corman?
Aye.
Mr. Janice?
Aye.
Ms. Deeds? Thank you.
Like to have a motion to adjourn?
Second.
Dr. Corman?
Aye.
Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Dr. Rentel?
Aye.
Mr. Janice?
Aye.
Ms. Deeds?